The river doesn't care about empires. For 7,000 years, it has flooded and receded, indifferent to the pharaohs who claimed divinity, the caliphs who built mosques over temples, the generals who promised freedom through force. Yet somehow, against every invasion, collapse, and reinvention, Egypt endures. Not as a continuous state has been conquered more times than almost any civilization on Earth, but as an idea, a geography, a stubbornness encoded in the silt of the Nile. This is not a story about inevitability. It's about choices made in the shadow of scarcity, power built on grain and gold, and the peculiar human capacity to turn flood cycles into cosmic order. Egypt was not given. It was engineered, negotiated, and reimagined across millennia by people who understood that survival requires more than water it requires. Institutions that outlast their creators. Look at a map of ancient Egypt, and you'll notice something strange. While Mesopotamia fractured into competing city-states, Uruk, Lagash, claiming its own gods and kings, Egypt unified early and stayed unified for centuries. Why? The easy answer is geography. The Nile is predictable. Unlike the chaotic flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates, which could drown entire harvests without warning, the Nile swelled gently each summer, depositing rich black soil across the valley before retreating on schedule. This predictability allowed for planning, for surplus, for the kind of long-term thinking that builds pyramids instead of defensive walls. But geography is only opportunity. Humans decide what to do with it. 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a desert. It was green, filled with lakes and migrating herds. Hunter-gatherers roamed freely. But as the climate shifted, the green belt shrank. Lakes dried, grasslands turned to sand. By 6000 BCE, the Sahara became a vast barrier. Communities that had once roamed were now forced into a narrow river valley, competing for land, water, and resources. This compression forced a choice: constant warfare or cooperation to manage the land. Egypt chose cooperation, or more precisely, a group of early settlements chose hierarchy. Those who controlled the flood controlled the food, and those who controlled the food could demand labor, taxes, and loyalty. The Nile didn't create civilization. It created the conditions where centralized authority became advantageous. If you scatter people across abundant land, they stay decentralized. Compress them around a single resource, and hierarchy emerges. This is where the hydraulic hypothesis comes in. Historian Karl Wittfogel argued that large-scale irrigation projects require coordinated labor, which requires bureaucracy and authority. If you dig a canal that serves 100 villages, someone needs to decide how much water each gets, when farmers plant, and who repairs broken dikes. That someone becomes indispensable. Over generations, indispensability becomes legitimacy. The priest who tracks the flood becomes the king who commands it. The records he keeps, first as marks on clay, later as hieroglyphs, become the foundation of state power. Writing in Egypt wasn't invented to tell stories. It was invented to count grain, to track taxes, to record which villages had paid their dues. Literature, poetry, and religious hymns came later, after the technology of writing was developed for administration. This is a pattern we see in early civilizations. Writing emerges not from a desire for abstract ideas, but from the practical needs of state management. You cannot run a centralized bureaucracy without records. Writing is power made visible. By 3100 BCE, Upper and Lower Egypt had unified under a single ruler, a figure we call Narmer or me. What matters is the model that emerged. The pharaoh was not just a king. He was a living god, the earthly manifestation of Horus, responsible for maintaining cosmic order, balance, and justice. When the Nile flooded on time, it was because the pharaoh had pleased the gods. When the flood failed, divine order was disrupted, and the pharaoh's legitimacy wavered. This was ideology as infrastructure, a way to make political authority seem as inevitable as the sunrise. In Mesopotamia, kings were human. They could be overthrown, but in Egypt, the king was the god. You cannot overthrow the divine without unraveling the cosmos itself. This made Egyptian kingship remarkably stable, but also fragile. As long as the Nile flooded and harvests were good, the system was unshakable. When the floods failed, the entire foundation cracked. This divine kingship had practical consequences. If the pharaoh is a god, his death is a cosmic crisis. The smooth transition of power becomes essential to maintaining Ma'at. This is why Egyptian art obsesses over continuity, why statues of pharaohs from different dynasties look nearly identical. The individual ruler mattered less than the institution. The face changes, but the god-king remains. This explains the conservative nature of Egyptian culture. Innovation wasn't valued. Tradition was. To change too much was to risk cosmic disaster. The Old Kingdom, from roughly 2700 to 2200 BCE, perfected this system. It also built the pyramids. We misunderstand the pyramids if we see them as just vanity projects. They were economic engines. Constructing the Great Pyramid of Khufu required tens of thousands of workers, over 20 years farmers during the flood season, craftsmen and engineers coordinating logistics on a scale never before seen. The state fed these workers with grain from royal storehouses, redistributing agricultural surplus. This wasn't charity. It was economic policy. By employing laborers on monumental projects, the state kept people fed when they couldn't farm, prevented social unrest, and reinforced the pharaoh's godhood through sheer architectural spectacle. The pyramid was a message written in stone. Only a god could command this. Only a god could organize tens of thousands to haul millions of limestone blocks into perfect alignment. The message worked. For 500 years, the Old Kingdom ruled largely unchallenged. The pyramids weren't just tombs. They were statements of power, guarantees of cosmic order, and employment programs all at once. Recent archaeology shows these workers were well fed, received medical care, and were buried with respect. They were not slaves, but citizens, participating in a grand national project. They weren't just moving stones. They were maintaining Ma'at, ensuring the Nile would flood and the sun would rise. But no system is permanent. Around 2200 BCE, something broke. The Nile's floods weakened. This wasn't a single catastrophic failure, but a gradual decline, likely linked to a global climate event. Harvests diminished. The centralized grain system, which worked beautifully in times of surplus, collapsed. Regional governors, called nomarchs, began withholding resources and building their own power bases. Why send grain to the capital when your own people are hungry? Why obey a god-king who can no longer make the Nile flood? The Old Kingdom fragmented into rival centers of authority. Power devolved from the central state to regional strongmen. This period, the first intermediate period, was a catastrophe by the standards of cosmic order. Mat had failed. The divine kingship model, which had seemed unshakable, revealed its vulnerability. When the environmental conditions that supported centralized authority changed, the authority itself collapsed. Ancient Egypt would rise again. But the lesson was clear. Even empires built of stone are ultimately sustained by water, grain, and the belief of their people. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more journeys into our shared past. There's a remarkable text from this era called The Admonitions of Ippur, a lament that captures the psychological shock of social collapse. The poor have become rich, it says, and the rich have nothing. Those who once wore fine linen now wear rags. The riverbanks are red with blood. Slaves have become masters, and masters have become slaves. The text is hyperbolic, certainly written in the tradition of lamentations that exaggerate suffering to make theological or political points. But it reveals what terrified the Egyptian elite, not merely poverty or violence, but disorder. The idea that the world could be turned upside down, that the categories that structured reality, pharaoh and subject, priest and peasant, noble and commoner, life and death, could blur or reverse. Collapse wasn't just economic, it was ontological, a crisis of meaning. If the pharaoh is a god and the pharaoh fails, what does that mean? Is he not a god after all? If Mat can be disrupted, is the universe not ordered? These questions didn't have easy answers. The intermediate periods of Egyptian history are not footnotes. They are laboratories where Egyptian culture wrestled with the problem of theodicy, how to explain suffering and disorder in a cosmos supposedly governed by divine order. The answers that emerged shaped Egyptian religion and politics for millennia. Recovery came slowly, driven by a dynasty based in Thebes in Upper Egypt, the Middle Kingdom, beginning around 2050 BCE, stored centralized rule but learned from the Old Kingdom's failures. The pharaohs of the 11th and 12th dynasties introduced administrative reforms designed to prevent the kind of fragmentation that had occurred. One innovation was the co-regency system, where the ruling pharaoh elevated his successor to joint rule before death. This ensured smooth transitions and prevented succession crises that could fracture the state. The son ruled alongside the father, learning governance, establishing authority, making it clear who would inherit power. When the old pharaoh died, the transition was seamless because the new pharaoh was already pharaoh. The Middle Kingdom also diversified the economy, reducing dependence on Nile agriculture alone. Nubian gold mines to the south were exploited more systematically, providing wealth that could be used to buy loyalty, fund military campaigns, and buffer against agricultural shortfalls. Trade networks expanded eastward to Punt, a land somewhere along the Red Sea coast, possibly modern-day Somalia, Eritrea, or Yemen, that supplied incense, myrrh, ebony, ivory, and exotic goods that Egyptian elites craved. These trade expeditions required naval technology, diplomatic relationships, and the projection of power beyond Egypt's borders. The Middle Kingdom was more cosmopolitan, more pragmatic, more willing to engage with foreign peoples than the Old Kingdom had been. Religiously, the Middle Kingdom democratized the afterlife in ways that had profound social and economic consequences. In the Old Kingdom, only the pharaoh and select elites could hope for eternal life. Their tombs were stocked with elaborate spells, food offerings, servants, everything needed for existence in the afterlife. The common people simply died. But by the Middle Kingdom, a broader class of Egyptians had access to funerary texts, the coffin texts, so called because they were inscribed on coffins rather than tomb walls. These texts provided spells and instructions for navigating the afterlife, promising immortality to anyone who could afford the rituals. This was not egalitarianism, it was a new market. Priests sold access to eternity. The middle-class scribes, provincial officials, successful merchants bought it. Death became an industry, and the industry stabilized the economy by creating demand for craftsmen, priests, tomb builders, and funerary goods. But external threats loomed, and here we encounter one of the most traumatic episodes in Egyptian history. Around 1800 BCE, Egypt entered another intermediate period, this time triggered not by climate, but by invasion. A people the Egyptians called the Hyksos, the term means rulers of foreign lands, migrated into the Nile Delta, and eventually seized control of Lower Egypt. The Hyksos were likely a coalition of Semitic groups from the Levant, possibly including Canaanites, Hurrians, and others, driven by their own pressures to migrate southward. They brought new military technology that the Egyptians had never encountered: the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow made of wood and horn that could shoot farther and harder than Egyptian bows, and bronze weaponry that outclassed Egyptian copper. For the first time in Egyptian history, foreigners ruled Egypt, not as conquerors who destroyed the old order and replaced it with their own, but as foreign pharaohs who adopted Egyptian titles, performed the necessary rituals, claimed to maintain Mat. The psychological impact was profound and lasting. Egyptian identity had been rooted in the idea of divine protection, of Mat as a cosmic shield that protected Egypt from the chaos beyond its borders. The Hyksos shattered that illusion. They ruled Lower Egypt for over a century, from roughly 1750 to 1550 BCE, while Egyptian rulers in Thebes controlled Upper Egypt. The country was divided. The cultural trauma was generational. Egyptian texts written after the Hyksos period described them with visceral hatred as barbarians who desecrated temples, destroyed sacred sites, ruled through violence and oppression. How much of this is true and how much is propaganda is impossible to determine. What's clear is that the Hyksos period left deep psychological scars. When a Theban dynasty, the 17th dynasty, followed by the 18th, finally expelled the Hyksos around 1550 BCE, the victory was celebrated not just as a military triumph, but as a restoration of cosmic order, a purging of foreign pollution, a return to the natural state of Egyptian supremacy. Yet, the Hyksos left a legacy that the Egyptians, despite their hatred, could not ignore. The military innovations the Hyksos brought: chariots, composite bows, superior bronze weapons, were too effective to abandon. The Egyptians adopted them wholesale and turned them against future enemies. Invasion had forced technological adoption. Humiliation had bred pragmatism. This is a pattern you see throughout history. Defeated societies that survive often do so by learning from their conquerors, adopting the technologies and tactics that defeated them, and using them to ensure they're never defeated again. The Hyksos period transformed Egyptian military culture from defensive to offensive, from inward-looking to expansionist. The expulsion of the Hyksos inaugurated the new kingdom, Egypt's imperial age. And this was a fundamentally different Egypt: expansionist, militaristic, wealthy, beyond anything the old or middle kingdoms had imagined. The new kingdom pharaohs, particularly Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty, launched aggressive military campaigns into the Levant and Mesopotamia. Thutmose III, who ruled in the 15th century BCE, is sometimes called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. He conducted 17 military campaigns over 20 years, reaching the Euphrates River, conquering city-states in Syria and Canaan, establishing Egyptian hegemony over a vast tribute empire. Egypt was no longer content to defend its borders. It demanded tribute from vassal states, extracted wealth from conquered territories, and established a professional standing army funded by Nubian gold. The economy of the new kingdom shifted from redistribution to extraction. The state still employed workers on monumental projects. The new kingdom built extensively in Thebes, constructing the massive temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor, but much of the wealth now came from outside Egypt. Vassal states sent annual tribute: gold, silver, timber, horses, exotic goods. The Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence found at the city of Akhetaten, provide a fascinating glimpse into how this system worked. Local rulers in Canaan and Syria wrote obsequious letters to the pharaoh, addressing him as the sun god, promising loyalty, requesting military support against rivals. The pharaoh's role was to protect his vassals from external threats in exchange for their tribute and loyalty. When he failed to do so, the system began to break down, as happened during the reign of Akhenaten. But before we get to Akhenaten, we need to talk about Hatshepsut, one of the most remarkable figures in Egyptian history and one of the few female pharaohs. Hatshepsut came to power around 1479 BCE as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III. She was supposed to rule temporarily until he came of age. Instead, she declared herself pharaoh and ruled for over 20 years. This required extraordinary political skill and ideological innovation. Egyptian kingship was gendered male. The pharaoh was Horus, a male deity. The iconography, the titles, the rituals all assumed maleness. Hatshepsut navigated this by adopting male regalia. She wore the false beard of kingship in official depictions, and by constructing a divine birth narrative, claiming that the god Amun had impregnated her mother, making her the literal daughter of a god. Hatshepsut's reign was notable for emphasizing trade over military conquest. Her most famous achievement was a trading expedition to Punt, meticulously documented in reliefs at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. The reliefs show Egyptian ships, exotic goods, even the Queen of Punt depicted with exaggerated features that suggest the Egyptians found her appearance unusual. Hatshepsut presented this expedition as a triumph, bringing back incense, trees, myrrh, gold, ivory, and exotic animals. Trade, not war, was her legacy. This was unusual for a new kingdom pharaoh, and it's tempting to read gender into Ita, female pharaoh choosing diplomacy over violence, but that may be anachronistic. Hatshepsut also conducted military campaigns when necessary. She simply chose to emphasize trade in her propaganda because it served her political needs. After Hatshepsut's death, Thutmose III came into his own and launched the military campaigns that made Egypt an empire. But he also tried to erase Hatshepsut from history. Her statues were defaced, her name chiseled from inscriptions, her monuments claimed by her successors. This erasure likely wasn't about personal vendetta or misogyny, though those may have played a role. It was about legitimacy. Thutmose III needed to present himself as the rightful successor to his father, not as someone who had been sidelined by a female regent who usurped the throne. Hatshepsut's very existence was a problem for the narrative he wanted to tell. So she was erased, incompletely, leaving us with fragmentary evidence of a reign that challenged every assumption about gender and power in ancient Egypt. The new kingdom also saw the rise of a religious economic complex that would shape Egyptian politics for centuries. The Amen priesthood, based at Karnak in Thebes, accumulated massive wealth. Temples received donations from pharaohs, tribute from conquered territories, agricultural land as endowments. By the late New Kingdom, the Amen priesthood owned roughly a third of Egypt's arable land, employed tens of thousands, and functioned as a parallel power structure to the state. Temples were not just religious institutions, they were banks, storing grain, lending to farmers, managing vast estates. They were employers, providing jobs for priests, scribes, craftsmen, laborers. They were economic engines, and the wealth they controlled gave them political power that could rival the pharaoh himself. This set up a structural tension between royal and religious authority. The pharaoh needed the priesthood to legitimize his rule. He was crowned in the temple, performed rituals that reinforced his divine status, depended on priests to maintain cosmic order. But the priesthood's wealth made it independent, even threatening. This tension exploded during the reign of Akhenaten, one of the most bizarre and controversial episodes in Egyptian history. Akhenaten, who ruled from approximately 1353 to 1336 BCE, is one of history's great enigmas. He declared that there was only one god, the Aton, the solar discand, that all other deities were false. This was revolutionary, even shocking. Egyptian religion was polytheistic, with hundreds of gods representing different forces, places, and concepts. Akhenaten abolished them all. He closed temples, fired priests, defaced monuments that referenced the old gods, particularly Amenhotep, moved the capital from Thebes to a new city, Akhenaten, modern-day Amarna, that he built from scratch in Middle Egypt. He commissioned art that broke every convention of Egyptian aesthetics, depicting himself and his family in exaggerated, almost grotesque naturalism, elongated skulls, swollen bellies, androgynous bodies, intimate domestic scenes that had never before appeared in royal iconography. Scholars have debated Akhenaten's motives for over a century. Was he a visionary mystic who experienced genuine religious revelation? Was he mentally ill, suffering from some disorder that caused the physical deformities depicted in his art? Was he a political opportunist using religious reform to break the power of the Amen priesthood? The answer is probably all three to varying degrees, but the economic motive is undeniable. By abolishing the traditional pantheon, Akhenaten abolished the economic base of the priesthood. Temple lands reverted to the crown. Religious revenue streams centralized under royal control. Monotheism was a fiscal revolution disguised as theology, a power grab that used religion to justify the seizure of vast wealth. It failed spectacularly. Akhenaten was so focused on his religious revolution that he neglected foreign policy. Vassal states in the Levant, under pressure from the rising Hittite Empire to the north, sent desperate letters to Akhenaten begging for Egyptian military support. The Amarna letters are heartbreaking in their futility. Send troops, send gold, send anything. Please help us. Akhenaten sent nothing. He was too busy building his new city, composing hymns to the Aten, reimagining the cosmos. Meanwhile, Egypt's empire crumbled. City-states that had been loyal for generations fell to the Hittites or local rivals. The tributes stopped coming. The empire contracted when Akhenaten died, possibly assassinated, though the evidence is unclear. The backlash was swift. His successor was Tutankhamun, a child pharaoh, probably around 9 years old, almost certainly manipulated by powerful advisors, particularly the general Horemheb and the Vizieri. Tutankhamun restored the old gods, abandoned Akhenaten, and moved the capital back to Thebes. The temples were reopened, the priests reinstated, the traditional rituals resumed. Akhenaten's name was chiseled from monuments, his city abandoned to the desert. This is damnatio memoria, the erasure of memory, a technique the Romans would later perfect, but which the Egyptians practiced first. Akhenaten had tried to centralize too much, too fast, and the entrenched interests, priesthoods, bureaucrats, regional elites whose wealth and power depended on the old system destroyed him posthumously. The lesson was clear: even a god-king cannot overturn the entire social order without catastrophic consequences. Akhenaten's revolution failed not because it was theologically wrong, but because it threatened too many powerful groups simultaneously. This is a pattern in revolutionary attempts throughout history. Radical change requires either overwhelming force to crush opposition or broad coalitions to sustain it. Akhenaten had neither. He relied on royal authority alone, and when he died, that authority evaporated. The new kingdom's final great pharaoh was Ramesses II, who ruled for 67 years in the 13th century BCE. Ramesses was not the greatest military strategist. His most famous battle, Kadesh, against the Hittites around 1274 BCE, was at best a strategic stalemate, possibly a tactical defeat, but he was a propagandist of genius. After Kadesh, Ramesses commissioned inscriptions across Egypt celebrating his single-handed triumph against overwhelming odds. The texts describe him as a god on the battlefield, charging into enemy lines alone, slaughtering thousands. In reality, both sides were exhausted and signed a peace treaty, the first recorded international agreement in history. The treaty established a boundary between Egyptian and Hittite spheres of influence, arranged a royal marriage alliance, and committed both sides to mutual defense. But truth mattered less than narrative. Ramesses built more monuments than any pharaoh before him, and his name appears on so many structures that for centuries European scholars assumed multiple pharaohs named Ramesses had ruled, not realizing it was primarily one man with a construction obsession. Abu Simbel, with its colossal statues carved into a cliff face. The Ramesseum, the additions to Karnak. These were not just religious monuments, they were propaganda, statements of power, attempts to shape how posterity remembered him. It worked. Ramesses II is the pharaoh most people picture when they think of ancient Egypt: powerful, wealthy, building on a superhuman scale. He fathered over 100 children, a biological statement of divine virility, and lived into his 90s, an extraordinary lifespan for the ancient world. His reign was the new kingdom's high-water mark and the beginning of its decline, though he couldn't have known it. Imperial overstretch has a predictable pattern across civilizations. Military campaigns are expensive. Monumental building is expensive. Maintaining a tribute empire requires constant military presence to enforce loyalty and deter rivals. The costs compound over time. By the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, under Ramesses III, the treasury was strained. Ramesses III faced invasions by the mysterious Sea Peoples coalitions of Mediterranean raiders, whose origins remain debated, possibly including displaced populations from Anatolia, the Aegean, and the Levant, driven by their own climate and political crises. Egypt survived the Sea Peoples, barely, but the effort bankrupted the state. The most telling detail is a labor strike. Workers building Ramesses III's mortuary temple stopped work because their wages paid in grain from royal storehouses were months overdue. This was the first recorded labor action in history, documented in administrative texts that survived. The workers didn't riot. They didn't attack overseers. They simply stopped working and refused to resume until paid. This revealed the system's fragility. The new kingdom economy depended on the state's ability to collect taxes, store grain, and redistribute it to workers. When the system broke down, divine authority meant nothing. You cannot eat propaganda. You cannot feed your family with hymns to the pharaoh's greatness. The new kingdom collapsed slowly, eroding rather than shattering in a single catastrophic event. Egypt entered the Third Intermediate Period, another era of fragmentation lasting several centuries. This time, the fractures were both internal and external. Libyan mercenaries who had served in the Egyptian army for generations settled in the Nile Delta and eventually established their own dynasties, ruling as pharaohs in the north, while Egypt split into rival power centers. Thebes in the south, controlled by the Amun priesthood, became semi-independent. Egypt fragmented into competing polities, each claiming legitimacy, each too weak to dominate the others. Then, in the 8th century BCE, something unexpected and ironic happened. A Nubian kingdom to the south, centered at Napata in what is now Sudan, conquered Egypt and established the 25th dynasty, ruling as pharaohs from around 744 to 656 BCE. The irony is rich and worth dwelling on. Nubians, whom Egyptians had long regarded as barbarians fit only for exploitation in gold mines and military service, now ruled Egypt as pharaohs. And they ruled not as foreign conquerors imposing an alien system, but as traditionalists, more Egyptian than the Egyptians. The Kushite kings revived old kingdom art styles, rebuilt neglected temples, restored religious practices that had fallen into disuse, and presented themselves as restorers of Ma'at after centuries of disorder. Have you ever wondered about the secrets hidden in the sands of time? Today, we're embarking on an epic journey back to ancient Egypt, a civilization that shaped our world in ways you might not even realize. From towering pyramids to mysterious pharaohs, let's unravel the story of this incredible empire. Our story begins over 5,000 years ago, along the fertile banks of the Nile River. This river was the lifeblood of Egypt. Every year it would flood, leaving behind rich black soil that was perfect for farming. This natural gift allowed the ancient Egyptians to grow abundant crops, which meant they had enough food to support a large and complex society. It was this stability that laid the foundation for everything to come. Around 3100 BC, a legendary king named Menes, also known as Narmer, did something revolutionary. He united the two lands of Egypt, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north, into a single, powerful kingdom. This unification marked the beginning of the first Egyptian dynasty and kicked off a period we now call the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is often called the Age of the Pyramids, and for good reason. This was when the most iconic structures in human history were built. Think of the Great Pyramid of Giza, an architectural marvel that still baffles engineers today. It was built for the pharaoh Khufu, and for nearly 4,000 years, it stood as the tallest man-made structure on Earth. These weren't just tombs. They were grand monuments designed to ensure the pharaoh's eternal life and showcase their divine power. Building them required incredible organization, mathematical precision, and a massive workforce. But the Old Kingdom's glory eventually faded. A period of instability and civil war followed, known as the First Intermediate Period. Local governors became powerful, and the central authority of the pharaoh weakened. Egypt was fragmented. Then came the Middle Kingdom, a time of reunion and cultural revival. Pharaohs like Mentuhotep II brought Egypt back together, and the nation flourished once more. Art, literature, and trade reached new heights. Stories and poems from this era give us a glimpse into the hearts and minds of the ancient Egyptians, revealing their beliefs about life, death, and the gods. They also expanded their influence, trading with neighbors in Nubia to the south and the Near East. However, peace didn't last forever. A group of foreign rulers from Western Asia, known as the Hyksos, came to power in northern Egypt, marking the beginning of the Second Intermediate Period. The Hyksos brought with them new technologies, like the horse-drawn chariot and advanced bronze weapons. While they were seen as invaders, their presence ultimately forced the Egyptians to adapt and become stronger, and stronger they became. A series of powerful Theban princes rose up and drove the Hyksos out, ushering in the most glorious chapter in Egyptian history, the New Kingdom. This was the age of empire, the era of legendary pharaohs, whose names are still famous today. Think of Hatshepsut, one of history's most powerful female rulers. She declared herself pharaoh and reigned over a period of great peace and prosperity, commissioning spectacular building projects like her temple at Deir el-Bahari. Then there was Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh. He completely upended Egyptian religion by declaring that there was only one god, the sun, Disk-Aten, and moved the capital to a new city he built in the desert. His reign was a radical departure from thousands of years of tradition, and after his death, his successors worked hard to erase his memory. One of those successors was the boy king Tutankhamun. While he wasn't a particularly influential ruler during his short life, his legacy became immortal in 1922 when Howard Carter discovered his tomb almost completely intact. The treasures found inside gave us an unprecedented look into the wealth and craftsmanship of the New Kingdom. And of course, we can't forget Ramesses the Great, or Ramesses II. He was a master of propaganda and a colossal builder. He ruled for an incredible 67 years, fathered over 100 children, and covered Egypt with temples and statues of himself. His long reign marked the peak of Egypt's power and influence. He fought great battles, like the Battle of Kadesh, and signed one of the world's first known peace treaties. But like all great empires, the New Kingdom eventually began to decline. A series of invasions from groups like the Sea Peoples, internal struggles for power, and economic problems weakened the state. By the time we reach the late period, Egypt found itself frequently under the control of foreign powers, including Libyans, Nubians, and Persians. Then, in 332 BC, a new conqueror arrived, Alexander the Great. He was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. After his death, his general Ptolemy took control of Egypt and established the Ptolemaic dynasty. This was a fascinating period where Greek and Egyptian cultures blended. The city of Alexandria became the intellectual and cultural center of the ancient world, home to the great library and the towering lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The final pharaoh of Egypt was the brilliant and charismatic Cleopatra VII. She was a shrewd political operator who navigated the treacherous world of Roman politics, famously allying herself with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. But her story ends in tragedy. After her defeat at the hands of Octavian, who would become the Roman Emperor Augustus, she chose to end her own life rather than be paraded as a Roman captive. With her death in 30 BC, the 3,000-year-old story of Pharaonic Egypt came to an end. Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. From the first unification of the two lands to the final days of Cleopatra, the history of ancient Egypt is a breathtaking saga of innovation, power, belief, and endurance. Their achievements in writing, medicine, architecture, and government laid a foundation for civilizations to come. The pyramids still stand as a testament to their ambition, and the stories of their pharaohs continue to captivate us. The sands of Egypt still hold many secrets, but the story they've revealed so far is one of the greatest ever told. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through time. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more adventures into the past. See you next time. Christianity, once it became the state religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine and his successors, closed the pagan temples, banned the old rituals, and repurposed sacred sites. The monasteries of the Egyptian desert, founded by figures like Anthony and Pachymeres in the 3rd and 4th centuries, represented a new model of spirituality, ascetic and communal, that would influence Christian practice across Europe and beyond. But this new spirituality came at the cost of forgetting. The old gods became demons, the old priests sorcerers, the hieroglyphic script, sacred writing, became incomprehensible marks. The continuity with Pharaonic Egypt was broken, deliberately and systematically. When Arab armies conquered Egypt in 642 CE, they encountered a population that was Christian, resentful of Byzantine rule, and had only the dimmest cultural memory of the pharaohs whose monuments surrounded them. The Arab conquest under the general Amr ibn al-As was remarkably swift and relatively bloodless. The Byzantine forces, weakened by decades of warfare with Persia and internal theological disputes, could not mount effective resistance. Egyptian Christians, who had been persecuted by the Byzantine state for their Miaphysite theology, saw the Arabs as less oppressive. The Coptic patriarch Benjamin, who had been in hiding to avoid Byzantine persecution, returned to Alexandria and negotiated terms with Amr ibn al-As. The deal was pragmatic. Christians would pay the jizya, a tax on non-Muslims, and in exchange they could keep their religion, their churches, their communal leadership. For many Egyptian Christians, this was preferable to Byzantine oppression, which had included not just theological persecution, but heavy taxation and forced labor. Collaboration was practical, not ideological. It was also the beginning of Egypt's gradual Islamization, a process that would take centuries but fundamentally transform Egyptian identity. The process was gradual and incentivized economically rather than imposed by force. Early Arab rule was light-handed. Egypt became a province of the Umayyad Caliphate, governed from Damascus, and later the Abbasid Caliphate, governed from Baghdad. A new capital, Fustat later absorbed into Cairo, was built on the Nile's east bank, but much of Egyptian life continued as before. Coptic remained the majority language for generations. Administrative continuity was substantial. Many of the Byzantine bureaucrats simply continued their jobs under new management. Conversion to Islam was incentivized economically. Muslims paid zakat, a religious tax on wealth, that was generally lower than the jizya paid by non-Muslims. Over time, this created economic pressure to convert. Additionally, social mobility increasingly required Islamic identity. Advancement in administration, military service, and commerce favored Muslims. By the 12th century, Egypt was majority Muslim, though a significant Coptic Christian minority persisted, as it does to this day, comprising roughly 10% of the population. In 916 CE, a Shia dynasty from North Africa, the Fatimids, conquered Egypt and established a rival caliphate to the Sunni Abbasids in Baghdad. This was not just a political split, but a theological one. The Fatimids were Ismaili Shia, believing that leadership of the Muslim community should descend through Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, and specifically through Ismail, the seventh Imam. They rejected the legitimacy of the Sunni caliphs and claimed to be the true successors to Muhammad. The Fatimids founded Cairo al-Qahira, the victorious, as their capital in 969 and built Al-Azhar Mosque and University in 970. Initially an Ismaili Shia institution, Al-Azhar would later, after the Fatimids fell, become one of the most important centers of Sunni Islamic learning in the world, a role it maintains to this day. The Fatimid period was economically prosperous. Cairo became a major hub of Mediterranean and Indian Ocean trade. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim merchants operated in a relatively pluralistic commercial environment. The Cairo Genesa Documenta, massive cache of medieval manuscripts preserved in a Cairo synagogue and discovered in the late 19th century, reveal a cosmopolitan commercial world where religious identity mattered less than credit networks, family connections, and reputation. But the Fatimids weakened over time, undermined by succession crises, economic pressures, and the destabilizing impact of the Crusades. European knights, driven by a complex mix of religious fervor, economic opportunism, and political ambition, established crusader states in the Levantha Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch. These Christian states threatened Fatimid control over trade routes and presented a military challenge. The Fatimid Caliphate, internally divided and militarily weak, could not effectively respond. In 1171, a Kurdish general named Salah ad-Din, known in the West as Saladin, overthrew the last Fatimid caliph and restored Egypt to Sunni Islam, nominally under the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, but effectively independent. Saladin established the Ayyubid dynasty, centralized military power, and built the citadel of Cairo, a fortress that still dominates the city's skyline. He is remembered in the West primarily for his role in the Crusades, particularly for defeating the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and retaking Jerusalem. Western sources often depict him as a chivalrous opponent, a noble enemy, but this is largely myth-making. Saladin was a skilled military commander and politician who understood the value of reputation and propaganda. The Ayyubid dynasty, established by Saladin, didn't last long. His heirs were weak, and power slipped to their own military slaves, the Mamluks, mostly Turkic and Circassian boys, purchased from Central Asian and Caucasian slave markets, trained as elite soldiers, and converted to Islam. The Mamluk Sultanate, which ruled Egypt from 1250 to 1517, is one of history's most unusual political systems, a state governed by men who had been enslaved as children, trained as warriors, and then seized power through military prowess. Mamluk succession was not hereditary. You didn't inherit the sultanate because your father was sultan. You won it through military skill, political cunning, and often violence. Mamluk sultans rarely died peacefully in bed. This created a brutal meritocracy where leadership was earned, not inherited. It also created chronic instability, with frequent coups and succession struggles. Yet despite this instability, the Mamluks achieved remarkable things. They stopped the Mongol advance at the Battle of Anjalut in 1260, one of the most consequential battles in world history. The Mongols, who had swept through Central Asia, Persia, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia, seemed unstoppable. The Abbasid Caliphate fell when the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, killing the caliph and massacring the population. If the Mongols had taken Egypt, the entire Islamic world might have collapsed. The Mamluks, using superior knowledge of local terrain and tactical flexibility, defeated the Mongol army in the Jezreel Valley in what is now northern Israel. This victory halted the Mongol expansion westward and established the Mamluks as the dominant power in the region. The Mamluks also ended the Crusader presence in the Levant, capturing Acre in 1291, the last major Crusader stronghold. They protected Mecca and Medina, Islam's holiest cities, claiming the role of defenders of the faith and guardians of the pilgrimage routes. Economically, they controlled the lucrative spice trade between Asia and Europe. Spices, textiles, and luxury goods from India, Southeast Asia, and China traveled overland or via the Red Sea to Egypt, then were shipped across the Mediterranean to European markets. The Mamluks taxed this trade heavily, and it made Cairo fabulously wealthy. The architecture from this period, mosques, madrasas, mausoleums, with intricate geometric patterns and soaring minarets, testifies to the wealth flowing through the city. But monopolies are fragile, and the Mamluk monopoly on east-west trade was about to be broken. In 1498, the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama sailed around the southern tip of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and landed on the coast of India. This opened a direct sea route between Europe and Asia that bypassed Egypt entirely. Portuguese ships could now sail directly to the spice-producing regions by its source and sell in Europe without paying the middlemen, the Mamluk merchants, and the Venetian traders who had dominated the Mediterranean end of the trade. The economic impact on Egypt was catastrophic. Spice revenues plummeted. The Mamluk state, which depended heavily on taxes from trade, lost its primary income source. By the early 16th century, the Mamluks were broke. They were also technologically backward. The Mamluks had resisted adopting firearms and artillery, clinging to traditional cavalry tactics. Elite Mamluk warriors saw guns as dishonorable weapons, suitable only for common soldiers, not for the cavalry elite, whose identity was built around horsemanship and swordsmanship. This cultural conservatism proved fatal. When the Ottoman Sultan Selim I invaded Egypt in 1517, his army was equipped with cannons and muskets. At the Battle of Radania, near Cairo, Ottoman artillery shredded the Mamluk cavalry charges. It was a technological mismatch. The Mamluks fought bravely, but bravery couldn't overcome firepower. Egypt became an Ottoman province, and Eyalet ruled from Istanbul. But the Ottomans, pragmatic as always, didn't eliminate the Mamluks. They kept them as local administrators, tax collectors, and beys managing estates. This created a dual power structure, an Ottoman governor sent from Istanbul with theoretical authority, and Mamluk beys with actual control over much of the countryside. Ottoman rule in Egypt lasted 3 centuries, from 1517 to the early 19th century, but it was never total or direct. The Ottomans extracted grain for Istanbul, managed important trade routes, particularly the Red Sea, and the route to Mecca for the annual pilgrimage, and projected power into the Indian Ocean to counter Portuguese and later British expansion. But by the 18th century, Ottoman central authority was decaying. The empire faced military defeats in Europe, internal rebellions, and fiscal crises. In Egypt, Mamluk Beys reasserted autonomy, acting as semi-independent rulers while nominally acknowledging Ottoman sovereignty. 1. Mamluk Bey, Ali Bey al-Kabir, briefly attempted to break free from Ottoman control entirely in the 1760s, conquering Syria and declaring himself Sultan of Egypt. His rebellion was crushed, but it demonstrated how weak Ottoman control had become. By the late 18th century, Egypt was nominally Ottoman, but practically a patchwork of competing Mamluk factions fighting each other for dominance. Into this chaotic situation came Napoleon Bonaparte in 1798, and nothing would ever be quite the same. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign was a strategic gamble driven by geopolitical calculation and personal ambition. He aimed to cut Britain's route to India, establish a French presence in the eastern Mediterranean, and present himself as a liberator, bringing Enlightenment ideals to an oppressed people. He brought not just soldiers, but an extraordinary expedition of scientists, engineers, scholars, mathematicians, botanists, archaeologists, artists. This scientific component of the expedition produced the monumental description de l'Egypte, published in multiple volumes over decades, a comprehensive survey of Egypt's geography, antiquities, natural history, and contemporary society. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 by French soldiers digging fortifications near the town of Rashid made deciphering hieroglyphics possible decades later, giving birth to Egyptology as a modern academic discipline. Napoleon's expedition awakened European fascination with ancient Egypt, sparking an Egyptomania that influenced architecture, art, and design throughout the 19th century. But for Egyptians, the French occupation was a disaster. Napoleon's lofty rhetoric about liberty, equality, and fraternity rang hollow to a population subjected to military occupation, requisitions of food and supplies, and conscription. A popular uprising in Cairo in October 1798 was brutally suppressed. French artillery shelled neighborhoods. Summary executions followed. The occupation became increasingly oppressive as French resources dwindled and local resistance stiffened. The British and Ottomans formed an alliance to expel the French, and by 1801, after a series of military defeats, the French evacuated Egypt. Napoleon himself had already returned to France in 1799 to seize power in a coup. He abandoned his army, which continued fighting for another 2 years before surrendering. The psychological and political impact of the French occupation lingered long after the French departed. Egyptian elites, particularly military officers, had witnessed European military superiority firsthand. The gap in technology, organization, and firepower was undeniable. Traditional Mamluk cavalry tactics, which had worked for centuries, were annihilated by disciplined infantry formations and artillery. The French brought modern printing presses, establishing the first Arabic-language press in Egypt. They brought new administrative methods, scientific instruments, and Enlightenment ideas that challenged traditional assumptions. One man who observed all this carefully was an Albanian officer in the Ottoman army named Muhammad Ali. When the French left, Egypt descended into chaos. Mamluks fought each other for control. Ottoman forces tried to reassert authority. Albanian troops who had been brought to fight the French now sought their own advantage. Muhammad Ali, through a combination of cunning, military skill, and popular support from Cairo's ulama and merchants who saw him as a strong leader capable of restoring order. Seized power in 8. The Ottoman Sultan, unable to remove him by force, reluctantly recognized him as governor of Egypt. Muhammad Ali was not Egyptian. He was an Albanian Ottoman officer who spoke Turkish and never learned Arabic well, but he transformed Egypt more profoundly than any ruler since the Pharaohs, and his dynasty would rule Egypt until the 1952 revolution. His goal was to build a modern state capable of projecting power regionally, a state effectively independent of Ottoman control in everything but name. To achieve this, he needed a modern army. A modern army required an industrial base. An industrial base required capital. Capital required control over agriculture. He nationalized land, ending the traditional iltizam system of tax farming, where local elites collected taxes in exchange for a share. He imposed a state monopoly on cotton production, forcing farmers to sell their entire crop to the government at fixed prices. The state then sold the cotton on international markets at market prices, pocketing the difference. Egyptian cotton, particularly the long staple varieties developed during this period, was highly valued by European textile mills. The profits funded Muhammad Ali's modernization program. He built textile mills, weapons factories, shipyards, and arsenals. He conscripted Egyptian peasants fellahinin to a massive standing army trained by French military advisors, particularly veterans of Napoleon's campaigns. This was revolutionary. For centuries, Egyptians had been excluded from military service, which was reserved for foreign elites. Mamluks, Ottomans, Albanians. Now Egyptian peasants were being trained as modern soldiers. He sent student missions to Europe, particularly France, to study engineering, medicine, military science, and administration. These students would return to Egypt and staff the new bureaucracy, the new schools, the new institutions Muhammad Ali was creating. He was building a modern state through force and extraction. The conscription was brutal. Peasants were rounded up, torn from their villages, subjected to harsh military discipline. Many mutilated themselves to avoid service, cutting off fingers, blinding themselves because conscription often meant never returning home. The economic policies enriched the state, but impoverished farmers who had no say in prices and were forced to grow cash crops rather than food. But from Muhammad Ali's perspective, this was necessary. Building a modern state required sacrifices, and he was willing to make the peasants sacrifice. He also expanded militarily. He conquered Sudan in the 1820s to secure access to gold mines and slave labor for his army. He fought campaigns in Arabia on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan, crushing the Wahhabi movement. Then he invaded Syria in 1831, defeating Ottoman armies and threatening Istanbul itself. For a moment, it seemed possible that Muhammad Ali might overthrow the Ottoman Sultan and establish himself as ruler of a new empire stretching from Egypt to Anatolia. But Europe would not allow it. Britain and France, despite their rivalries, agreed that the Ottoman Empire must be preserved as a check against Russian expansion. A strong, independent Egypt under Muhammad Ali threatened to upset the balance of power. When Muhammad Ali's forces threatened Constantinople in 1840, European powers intervened. The London Convention of 1840 forced him to withdraw from Syria, reduce his army to a fraction of its size, and accept Ottoman suzerainty. He was allowed to keep Egypt and to pass it to his heirs, making his position hereditary. which was a concession, but his ambitions for regional dominance were crushed. Worse followed. The Treaty of Balta Liman in 1838 abolished Muhammad Ali's commercial monopolies and imposed free trade. This was demanded by Britain, which wanted access to Egyptian markets for British manufactured goods. The effect was to destroy the industrial base Muhammad Ali had built. Egyptian textile mills could not compete with British imports produced by mechanized factories in Manchester. The weapons factories closed. The shipyards fell silent. Egypt was reintegrated into the global economy, but not as an industrial power. Egypt would export raw materials, cotton, and import manufactured goods. The dependency relationship that would define modern Egypt had been established. Muhammad Ali's grandson, Ismail, who ruled from 1863 to 1889, accelerated Egypt's modernization and its debt. Ismail was educated in France and wanted to make Egypt European, or at least to make Egypt's cities look European. His famous statement was that Egypt was no longer part of Africa, but part of Europe. He built railways connecting major cities, telegraph lines, water systems, gas lighting for Cairo and Alexandria. He redesigned parts of Cairo along Parisian lines with wide boulevards, public squares, and European-style buildings. He built an opera house and commissioned Verdi to write Aida for its opening, though the opera wasn't ready in time. Most famously, he presided over the construction of the Suez Canal, which opened in 1869 with extravagant ceremonies attended by European royalty, including Empress Eugenie of France. The canal was an engineering marvel that cut weeks off the sea journey from Europe to Asia by eliminating the need to sail around Africa. It was also a diplomatic triumph for France and a financial disaster for Egypt. Ferdinand de Lesseps, a French diplomat and friend of the French royal family, had secured the concession to build the canal from Said Pasha, Ismail's predecessor. The financing was complex, but essentially Egypt provided much of the capital borrowed from European banks and the forced labor, while the Suez Canal Company, dominated by French investors, would reap the profits. Ismail borrowed recklessly from European banks at exorbitant interest rates, often 20% or higher. For a brief period during the American Civil War in the 1860s, this seemed sustainable because Egyptian cotton prices soared. European textile mills, cut off from American cotton due to the Union blockade of Confederate ports, turned to Egypt as an alternative supplier. Cotton prices spiked. Egypt experienced a boom. Ismail spent this windfall on more projects, more palaces, more debt. He believed the boom would continue. It didn't. When the American Civil War ended and American cotton returned to world markets, prices crashed. Egypt was suddenly unable to service its massive debts. By 1876, Egypt was bankrupt. European creditors, backed by their governments, imposed a debt commission, the Caisse de la Dette Publique, to oversee Egyptian finances and ensure debt payments. Dual control was established, with British and French officials supervising Egypt's budget. Egypt's nominal independence was hollowed out. The Khedive still ruled, but the British and French controlled the purse strings. This humiliation bred resentment, particularly in the Egyptian military. Army officers, many from rural backgrounds, had experienced poor conditions, delayed pay, and discrimination from the Turco-Circassian elite, who still dominated the officer corps, despite Muhammad Ali's reforms. In 1881, a colonel named Ahmad Urabi led a military protest that evolved into a nationalist uprising. Egypt for the Egyptians, he declared, a slogan that resonated powerfully with peasants, urban workers, and junior officers. The movement demanded constitutional government, an end to foreign control, and Egyptian sovereignty. The Yoruba movement briefly succeeded, forcing concessions from Khedive to Fiqh and establishing a government that included Yoruba as Minister of War. But Britain, fearing for the security of the Suez Canal and its strategic interests, decided to intervene militarily. In September 1818, British forces invaded Egypt, defeated the Egyptian army at the Battle of Tel el-Kabor, occupied Cairo, and established a military occupation. Britain promised the occupation was temporary, a brief intervention to restore order. It lasted 72 years. British rule in Egypt was never formalized as outright colonialism in the way India was governed. Officially, Egypt remained part of the Ottoman Empire until World War I, when Britain declared it a protectorate. In practice, the British consulginal governed Egypt, with the Khedive and later king serving as figureheads who occasionally clashed with British authority but ultimately deferred to it. British policy focused on two things: economic extraction, particularly cotton exports to British textile mills, and maintaining control over the Suez Canal, which was vital to British imperial communications with India and the Far East. The British built infrastructure where it served British interests. The Aswan Low Dam, completed in 1900, to regulated Nile flooding to enable more intensive cotton cultivation year-round. Railways connected cotton-growing regions to ports. Irrigation systems were expanded, but economic development that didn't serve British interests was discouraged. Egyptian industry was stifled. The economy remained dependent on exporting raw cotton and importing British manufactured goods. The British also built schools, which unintentionally created a class of Western-educated Egyptians who absorbed liberal and nationalists' ideas and would eventually lead the independence movement. Mustafa Kemal, a lawyer and journalist who died young in 1908, was an early voice for Egyptian independence, organizing nationalist societies and publishing newspapers that demanded British withdrawal. The Dinshaway incident in 19-0-6 inflamed nationalist sentiment. British officers, on a pigeon hunt near the village of Dinshaway, shot and wounded a woman. Villagers retaliated, beating the officers. One officer died, possibly from heatstroke, while running for help. The British response was savage. A special tribunal sentenced for villagers to death by hanging, others to public flogging and imprisonment. The executions were carried out in the village as a deliberate act of terror. The brutality shocked even British liberals and galvanized Egyptian nationalism. But the real rupture came with World War I, when the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of Germany in November 1914. Britain formally declared Egypt a protectorate, severing the nominal Ottoman connection. Egypt became a British war base. 1.5 million Egyptians were conscripted into the labor corps to support the British war effort in Palestine, Sinai, Mesopotamia. Crops were requisitioned. Inflation soared. Economic hardship was severe. Egyptians watched thousands of foreign troops, British, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians stationed on Egyptian soil, fighting a war that had nothing to do with Egyptian interests. When the war ended in November 1905, Egyptian nationalists expected that Woodrow Wilson's principle of self-determination, the idea that peoples should determine their own political future, would apply to Egypt. It didn't. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the victorious powers redrew the map of the Middle East, but ignored Egyptian demands. Saad Zaghloul, a former government minister and nationalist leader, formed a delegation Awaft in Arabic to represent Egyptian demands for independence at the peace conference. The British refused permission. When Zaghloul persisted, the British arrested him and exiled him to Malta in March 19. Egypt exploded. Strikes paralyzed Cairo and Alexandria. Demonstrations spread to every city and many villages. Railway workers stopped trains, lawyers abandoned courts, students boycotted classes. Remarkably, women participated publicly in political demonstrations for the first time in modern Egyptian history. Huda Sharawai, an upper-class woman who would become a pioneering feminist, helped organize women's marches. The uprising was remarkably broad, crossing class lines. Peasants, workers, professionals, religious leaders, women, students all united in demanding independence. The British brutally suppressed the uprising, but eventually made concessions. In 1922, Britain granted Egypt nominal independence. The Khedivate was abolished, and Egypt became a kingdom under King Fuad, son of Khedive Ismail. But Britain retained control over defense, foreign policy, the Suez Canal, and Sudan. This was independence in name only. Real power remained with the British, who could intervene whenever their interests were threatened. The arrangement satisfied almost no one, but established the framework for the next 30 years. The interwar period, from 1922 to World War II, was a frustrating cycle of false starts and dashed hopes. The Wafd Party, led by Saad Zaghloul and later by Mustafa al-Nahas, represented populist nationalism and won every free election. But the king first Fuad, then Farouk, after 1930-6- repeatedly dismissed Wafd governments with British backing whenever they threatened royal prerogatives or British interests. The British intervened in Egyptian politics constantly, manipulating elections, pressuring the palace, making and unmaking governments. The constitutional monarchy was a facade. Real power was contested between the palace, the Wafd, the British, and increasingly the military. Socioeconomic tensions deepened. A small landowner elite, many of them Turco-Circassian or Greek, controlled vast estates. Peasants remained landless, impoverished, and increasingly resentful. An urban middle-class effendia, the educated class of teachers, clerks, engineers, junior officers, saw limited opportunities and resented both the old elite and the British occupation. Two new political movements emerged in this environment. The Muslim Brotherhood, founded by Hassan al-Banna in 19-20-8, offered an Islamist alternative to secular nationalism. Al-Banna argued that Egypt's problems stemmed from abandoning Islamic principles. The solution was to build an Islamic state based on Sharia, promote social welfare, educate the masses, and resist Western cultural imperialism. The Brotherhood established schools, clinics, mosques, and social services, building a grassroots network that rivaled the state. Communist and socialist movements organized labor unions, advocated for workers' rights, and called for revolution. The political spectrum fractured between monarchists, liberal nationalists, Islamists, and socialists. World War II deepened the crisis. Egypt became a major British military base for the North Africa campaign against Germany and Italy. Cairo filled with Allied troops. The British requisitioned supplies, controlled the economy, and used Egypt as a logistics hub. In February 1942, when King Farouk attempted to appoint a prime minister unfriendly to Britain, British tanks surrounded Aberdeen Palace. British ambassador Sir Miles Lampson presented Farouk with an ultimatum: appoint a Wafd government acceptable to Britain or abdicate. Farouk capitulated. The humiliation was public and complete. Egypt's king was a British puppet. National sovereignty was a fiction. This incident had profound consequences. For Egyptian army officers stationed in Cairo, many of whom witnessed the British tanks surrounding the palace, the message was clear. Egypt was occupied, the king was powerless, and only force could achieve real independence. A secret organization formed within the military, the Free Officers Movement, committed to overthrowing the monarchy and ending British occupation. The leader who would emerge from this group was Gamal Abdel Nasser, a young officer from a modest background whose hatred of British imperialism was shaped by his experiences during the war. The trigger for revolution was the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Egypt, along with other Arab states, sent forces to Palestine to prevent the establishment of Israel and support Palestinian Arabs. And caught in a war it was unprepared to fight. Egyptian soldiers blamed the king, the British, and the corrupt political elite for the defeat. In the Fallujah pocket, a group of Egyptian troops was surrounded by Israeli forces. Among those trapped was Gamal Abdel Nasser. The experience radicalized him and convinced him that revolution was necessary. King Farouk, rather than resist, negotiated safe passage into exile. He left Egypt on his yacht on July 26, never to return. The monarchy was abolished in 1953, and Egypt became a republic. Initially, General Mohammed Naguib, the most senior and publicly acceptable of the free officers, served as president. But behind the scenes, Nasser was consolidating power. By 1954, Nasser had outmaneuvered Naguib, placed him under house arrest, and emerged as Egypt's undisputed leader. Nasser's revolution was not just political, it was psychological and social. For Egyptians, particularly the younger generation, Nasser represented dignity after decades of humiliation. He was Egyptian, not foreign. He spoke in colloquial Arabic directly to the masses, not in the formal classical Arabic of the elite. He was from a modest background. His father was a postal worker and rose through the military on merit. He embodied a new Egypt, free from foreign control, free from the old aristocracy, governed by Egyptians for Egyptians. His policies were radical by the standards of the time. Land reform laws capped individual land holdings at 200 fedenzo, about 200 acres, and redistributed confiscated estates to landless peasants. This broke the power of the old landed elite and created a new constituency loyal to the revolution. Nasser declared that canal revenues would fund the Aswan High Dam, a massive project to control the Nile, generate electricity, and expand irrigated agriculture. Britain and France, in collusion with Israel, launched an invasion in October-November 1956. The operation was militarily successful. Israeli forces overran Sinai. British and French paratroopers seized the Canal Zone, but politically disastrous. The United States, under President Eisenhower, was furious that it had not been consulted and feared the invasion would drive Arab states toward the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The Soviet Union threatened intervention. Under American and Soviet pressure, Britain and France withdrew in humiliation. This was the end of British and French imperial pretensions in the Middle East. Nasser, despite losing militarily, won politically. He had stood up to imperial powers and survived. His prestige across the Arab world soared. Nasser embraced Pan-Arabism, the ideology that Arab nations, divided by colonial borders, should unite politically and economically. He merged Egypt with Syria in 1950-8 to form the United Arab Republic. Though the union collapsed in 1961 when Syrian officers staged a coup and withdrew, he supported anti-colonial movements across Africa and Asian Algeria fighting France, in Yemen against royalist forces across the continent. His radio broadcasts in Arabic, particularly through Voice of the Arabs, reached millions, spreading the gospel of Arab nationalism, anti-imperialism, and socialism. Domestically, Nasser implemented Arab socialism, a state-led development model influenced by Soviet planning but adapted to Egyptian conditions. The state controlled major industries, set prices, guaranteed employment for university graduates, provided subsidized bread, fuel, and basic goods. The Aswan High Dam, completed in 1970 with Soviet funding after the United States withdrew its support, was the signature achievement. The dam controlled the Nile's flooding, enabled year-round irrigation, generated electricity, and symbolized Egypt's modernity and independence. But the social contract Nasser established subsidies, guaranteed jobs, and social services in exchange for political obedience was economically unsustainable. Without continuous growth, the economy stagnated. Chronic shortages plagued consumers. The bureaucracy grew bloated and inefficient. The population boomed. The dam enabled agricultural expansion, which supported more people, which increased demand, straining resources further. Soviet aid kept the system afloat, but it created dependency on a foreign power, the very thing Nasser had fought against. The catastrophe came in June 1957. Tensions with Israel had been escalating. Nasser, responding to Soviet intelligence reports, later revealed to be false, that Israel was massing troops to attack Syria, mobilized Egyptian forces in Sinai, and demanded the removal of UN peacekeepers from the border. He closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, a move Israel had declared would be an act of war. The situation spiraled beyond anyone's control. On the morning of June 5, 1960-7, Israel launched a preemptive strike. Israeli warplanes destroyed Egypt's air force on the ground within hours. Without air cover, Egyptian ground forces in Sinai were helpless. Israeli tanks advanced rapidly, routing Egyptian defenses. Within 6 days, Israel had occupied Sinai, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The defeat was total, shocking, humiliating beyond anything Egypt had experienced in modern times. Nasser appeared on television and offered his resignation. Millions of Egyptians took to the streets demanding he stay. He remained, but the psychological damage was irreversible. Arab nationalism, which had promised liberation, unity, and strength, had delivered humiliation. The myth of Arab military power was shattered. The War of Attrition along the Suez Canal dragged on from 1967 to 1970, a grinding, inconclusive conflict that exhausted both Egypt and Israel. Nasser died of a heart attack on September 28, 1970, at age 52. Millions mourned. His funeral in Cairo was attended by an estimated 5 million people, an outpouring of grief that demonstrated how deeply he had connected with ordinary Egyptians. He had restored Egyptian dignity, ended foreign occupation, and given Egyptians pride. But he left economic chaos, military defeat, and an unresolved conflict with Israel. His successor, Anwar Sadat, inherited a crisis. Sadat understood that Egypt's economy was collapsing. Soviet aid was insufficient. Nasser's socialism had created inefficiencies, corruption, and chronic shortages. If Egypt could realign toward the West, attract American and Gulf investment, perhaps it could escape the economic trap. On October 6, 1973, during Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal in a meticulously planned surprise attack. Egyptian engineers used water cannons to breach the sand embankments of the Israeli Bar Lev line. The war turned when Israel counterattacked, crossing the canal and encircling the Egyptian Third Army. A ceasefire was brokered under American and Soviet pressure. Militarily, the war was at best a draw, possibly a strategic loss for Egypt, but psychologically, it was transformative. Egypt had demonstrated it could fight competently, that Israeli invincibility was a myth, that Arab armies could plan and execute complex operations. This psychological victory was enough to allow negotiations from a position of dignity rather than humiliation. But Sadat gambled that peace with Israel would unlock American support, return Sinai, and allow Egypt to focus on economic development rather than endless military confrontation. Israel committed to withdrawing from Sinai, which occurred in stages and was completed in 1982. The United States pledged $1.3 billion annually in military aid to Egypt, which continues to the present day, making Egypt the second largest recipient of American aid after Israel. Egypt was expelled from the Arab League until 1999 and isolated diplomatically in the Arab world. But it gained peace, the return of Sinai, and massive American support. Domestically, Sadat implemented in Fita the economic opening, dismantling Nasser's socialist policies. He encouraged private investment, reduced state control, invited foreign capital, and cut subsidies. The result was rapid growth for a new capitalist class real estate developers, importers, contractors with government connections, while the urban poor suffered. Bread riots erupted in January 1977 when the government, under IMF pressure, tried to cut food subsidies. Protesters chanted, "Hero of the Crossing, where is our breakfast?" mocking Sadat's military reputation while highlighting economic failure. Sadat backed down on subsidy cuts, but the message was clear. Economic liberalization, without a social safety net, was politically explosive. Sadat's peace with Israel and his repression of Islamist groups made him enemies on multiple fronts. The Muslim Brotherhood and more radical groups like Islamic Jihad saw peace with Israel as betrayal and Sadat as an apostate. On October 6, 1981, during a military parade commemorating the October War, soldiers affiliated with Islamic Jihad assassinated Sadat. Vice President Hosni Mubarak, sitting beside Sadat, was wounded but survived. He became president and would rule for the next 30 years, presiding over an era defined by stagnation and repression. Mubarak's Egypt was stable on the surface but rotting underneath. He maintained emergency law, which had been in effect almost continuously since 1967, giving security services sweeping powers to arrest without charge, detain indefinitely, and censor media. The ruling National Democratic Party dominated parliament through electoral manipulation and fraud. Political opposition was tolerated within narrow limits. The Muslim Brotherhood, officially banned, was allowed to operate social services and even run candidates as independents, provided they didn't threaten the regime's core interests. This was controlled pseudo-pluralism, a safety valve to release pressure without allowing real change. Economically, Mubarak accelerated neoliberal reforms. State enterprises were privatized, often in corrupt insider deals where regime cronies and military officers bought assets at below-market prices. The economy grew impressively in the mid-2000s, with GDP growth rates reaching 7%, but wealth concentrated at the top. A small elite amassed fortunes, while poverty rates remained around 40%. Youth unemployment was endemic. University graduates drove taxis or emigrated. The gap between rich and poor became a chasm. Mubarak's son Gamal was groomed to succeed him, violating the revolutionary legitimacy the regime claimed. The idea of a hereditary republic, Jamhuriya, Malakiya in Arabic, literally monarchical republic, contradicted everything the free officers had fought for. Public resentment grew, but the security apparatus, the Mukhabara, was pervasive and ruthless. Dissent was crushed. Torture was routine in police stations. Political prisoners numbered in the tens of thousands. In December 2010, in Tunisia, a street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire after police confiscated his cart. His death triggered protests that toppled President Ben Ali on January 14, 2011. Egyptians, watching via satellite television and social media, realized that dictators could fall. On January 25, 2011, thousands gathered in Tahrir Square in Cairo, calling for Mubarak's resignation. The protests grew. A cross-class coalition united around a single demand: the regime must fall. Students, workers, Islamists, liberals, the unemployed professionals all came together. Social media, Facebook, Twitter amplified the movement, though it was rooted in real grievances that had been building for decades. The military, which had always been the backbone of the state since 1952, faced a choice: fire on protesters and risk civil war, or ease Mubarak out and preserve the institution. On February 11, After 18 days of protests, Mubarak stepped down. The Supreme Council of Armed Forces took power, promising a transition to civilian rule. The euphoria was immense. Tahrir Square erupted in celebration. Egypt was free, or so it seemed. People who had never believed change was possible now believed anything was possible. But revolutions destroy more easily than they build. The SCAF ruled as a military junta, maintaining emergency law, promising elections but slow-walking reforms. The revolutionaries wanted faster change. Protests continued. The economy collapsed. Tourism evaporated. Foreign investment fled. Unemployment soared. Elections were finally held. Parliamentary elections in late 2011 and early 2012 gave Islamist parties the Muslim Brotherhood and even more conservative Salafis roughly 70% of seats. The presidential election in June 2012 came down to a choice between Mohamed Morsi, the Brotherhood candidate, and Ahmed Shafiq, Mubarak's last prime minister. Morsi won narrowly, becoming Egypt's first democratically elected president. Morsi's year in power was a disaster of incompetence and overreach. In November 2012, he issued a constitutional declaration granting himself sweeping powers, placing his decisions above judicial review. The move was intended to protect the Constitutional Assembly from court dissolution, but was perceived as dictatorial. The constitution drafting process, dominated by Islamists, alienated liberals, secularists, Coptic Christians. Economically, Morsi was incompetent. Fuel shortages led to blackouts. Breadlines grew. Inflation spiked. Polarization deepened. Egyptian society split into pro- and anti-Morsi camps. By June 2013, the Tamarod rebel movement had collected millions of signatures demanding Morsi's resignation and early elections. On June 30th, massive demonstrations filled streets across Egypt, possibly the largest protests in Egyptian history. General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the defense minister Morsi had appointed, issued an ultimatum: resolve the crisis within 48 hours or the military would intervene. On July 3, 2013, Sisi deposed Morsi in a military coup, though the regime insists it was responding to popular will. A brief constitutional declaration was issued, a civilian interim president installed, and the Brotherhood outlawed. On August 14th, security forces moved to disperse Brotherhood sit-ins at Rabaa al-Adawiya Square in Cairo. The massacre that followed killed at least 800, possibly more. Bodies piled up. The military and police showed no restraint. The Brotherhood was banned, its leaders imprisoned or exiled, its assets seized. Egypt's brief democratic experiment was over. Sisi consolidated an authoritarian state more repressive than anything under Mubarak. Political prisoners are estimated at 60,000 or more. Targets include not just the Brotherhood, but liberals, journalists, activists, comedians, anyone who criticizes the regime. Laws restricting protests, NGOs, and media were tightened. Self-censorship became pervasive. Sisi cultivated a cult of personality, presenting himself as Egypt's savior from chaos, the strong man who alone could maintain order. In 2019, constitutional amendments extended presidential term limits, allowing Sisi to rule until 2030 and possibly beyond. The military, which already controlled significant economic assets under Mubarak, expanded its economic empire dramatically. Current estimates suggest the armed forces control 40% of the economy, running businesses from construction to agriculture to consumer goods. They crowd out the private sector, stifle competition, and operate outside normal regulatory oversight. Sisi's economic strategy centers on megaprojects designed to signal strength and modernity. The new administrative capital, 45 kilometers east of Cairo, is budgeted at $58 billion. The project involves relocating government ministries, embassies, and creating a new city from scratch. The official rationale is to decongest Cairo and create a modern bureaucratic hub. Critics see a vanity project that drains resources, benefits elites, and ignores the needs of ordinary Egyptians struggling with inflation and unemployment. The Suez Canal was expanded in 2014 and 2015, allowing two-way traffic and larger ships. Roads, bridges, tunnels proliferate. Infrastructure spending creates visible results. New highways, massive bridges that can be showcased in propaganda. But the costs are staggering, and the economic returns questionable. Egypt's external debt has exploded, quadrupling from roughly $40 billion in 2013 to $165 billion by 2024. Multiple IMF bailouts have imposed harsh austerity measures. Fuel subsidies were slashed, causing prices to spike. The currency was devalued multiple times, making imports more expensive. Bread subsidies, the most politically sensitive, have been cut back. Inflation has been severe, particularly in 2022 to 2024, eroding real wages and pushing millions into poverty. The currency floats, meaning every devaluation makes imports more expensive, and Egypt imports more than half its food, including wheat, making it the world's largest wheat importer. This dependence on global commodity markets leaves Egypt acutely vulnerable. When Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 disrupted wheat exports, both Russia and Ukraine are major suppliers to Egypt. Bread prices surged. The government scrambled to secure alternative supplies. This vulnerability is structural. Egypt's population of over 110 million cannot be fed from domestic agriculture alone. The country is dependent on imports, dependent on remittances from workers abroad, dependent on Gulf aid, dependent on IMF loans. Geopolitically, Sisi has aligned closely with Gulf states, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, who have provided tens of billions in financial support through investments, deposits in Egyptian banks, and direct aid. Egypt mediates conflicts in Gaza, using its border with the Strip and its relationships with both Israel and Palestinian factions to broker ceasefires. Relations with Turkey, hostile for years after Erdogan supported the Brotherhood, have normalized as both countries recalibrate regional positions. But the most existential threat Egypt faces is water. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, under construction on the Blue Nile in Ethiopia, threatens Egypt's water security in ways that cannot be overstated. The Blue Nile provides roughly 85% of the Nile's total flow. Ethiopia argues the dam is essential for development, electricity generation, and lifting millions out of poverty. Egypt sees it as an existential threat. If Ethiopia fills the reservoir too quickly, Egypt's water supply could drop catastrophically, devastating agriculture that depends on Nile irrigation and threatening drinking water for millions. Negotiations have been ongoing for over a decade, with no binding agreement on filling schedules or long-term operation. The rhetoric from Cairo has been increasingly militaristic. Sisi has stated repeatedly that water is a red line, a threat that cannot be clearer. Some Egyptian officials have discussed military options, though attacking the dam would be extraordinarily risky and likely catastrophic for regional stability. Climate change compounds the water crisis. The Nile Delta, where much of Egypt's agriculture and population is concentrated, is vulnerable to sea level rise. Alexandria, Egypt's second-largest city and major port, faces catastrophic flooding risks within decades. Agricultural land in the delta could be inundated with saltwater, destroying fertility. Water scarcity is already severe. Egypt has roughly 570 cubic meters of renewable fresh water per capita annually, approaching the UN's absolute scarcity threshold of 500 cubic meters. Population growth makes this worse. Egypt adds roughly 2 million people every year. The demographic pressures are immense. Egypt's population exceeds 110 million as of 2026 and is the fastest growing in the Middle East and North Africa. 60% of the population is under 30. The economy needs to create roughly 700,000 jobs annually just to absorb new entrants to the labor market. Job creation lags far behind. The informal economy absorbs some unemployment street vendors, unregistered workshops, day labor, but this is precarious work without security or benefits. Emigration offers an escape for those with skills or capital. Egyptian workers in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait send back roughly $32 billion annually in remittances, about 8% of GDP. Egypt's economy, in a very real sense, runs on money sent home by workers abroad. This creates a paradox. The state has failed to create sufficient opportunities, so people leave, but their leaving sustains the state through remittances that fund imports and consumption. Looking across Egypt's 7,000-year history, certain patterns emerge with eerie consistency. Geography remains central. The Nile still defines Egyptian life, but now it's contested by upstream nations in ways it never was in the Pharaonic period. Centralization persists as a political instinct. From pharaonic divine kingship to modern military authoritarianism, the concentration of power in a single figure or institution, justified by appeals to order against chaos, is remarkably consistent. Foreign intervention is a constant. The Hyksos, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Ottomans, French, British, and now the IMF and Gulf states. Egypt has rarely enjoyed complete sovereignty. Economic dependency evolves but endures. Cotton monoculture in the 19th century gave way to remittances and aid in the 21st. But the pattern of integration into global economic systems on unfavorable terms remains. Egyptian identity has oscillated between different anchors: Pharaonic, Coptic, Christian, Islamic, Arab, Egyptian nationalist. The question of what Egyptian means today remains contested. Yet Egypt survives. The state has collapsed and reformed repeatedly. Religions have changed. Languages have shifted from ancient Egyptian to Coptic to Arabic. The population has been conquered, converted, occupied, but something persists. Call it Egyptianness, a continuity rooted not in political independence, but in place. The Nile Valley, the Delta, the desert, the land itself. The Coptic Church preserves fragments of ancient Egyptian in its liturgy. The pyramids stand as monuments. Arabic place names often preserve ancient roots. The Nile flows, though its future is increasingly uncertain. Egypt's present is precarious in ways that echo past crises, but with new dimensions. Sisi's authoritarianism offers stability at the cost of freedom and long-term economic sustainability. The mega projects signal strength, but accumulate unsustainable debt. The military's economic dominance stifles entrepreneurship and distorts markets. The population grows faster than resources or opportunities. Water scarcity, climate change, regional instability, these are challenges that cannot be solved with nationalism, propaganda, or infrastructure alone. The future is genuinely uncertain. Egypt could reform, diversify its economy, develop knowledge industries, liberalize politically, and manage a transition to a sustainable model. This seems unlikely given current trajectories, but remains possible. More plausibly, Egypt muddles through authoritarianism persists. Growth remains anemic. Instability is managed through repression and Gulf subsidies. Emigration serves as a pressure valve. Egypt survives in chronic crisis, neither collapsing nor thriving. The pessimistic scenario involves debt default, water conflict with Ethiopia escalating to military confrontation, regime collapse, and potential fragmentation or civil conflict. State failure in a country of 110 million would be catastrophic, not just for Egypt, but for the entire region. Egypt has survived catastrophes before the Bronze Age collapse, intermediate periods, foreign conquests, colonial occupation. Each time, it reorganized, adapted, and persisted. But history offers no guarantees of survival. The Nile that once flooded with predictable reliability now depends on Ethiopian policy decisions and climate stability beyond anyone's control. The centralized state that once redistributed grain surpluses now redistributes debt. The monuments that once signaled divine order now serve as tourist attractions, a revenue stream vulnerable to terrorism, pandemics, and political instability. What survives when empires fall? The monuments, certainly the pyramids, will outlast any government. Cultural memory survives in fragments, Coptic liturgy, architectural styles, folktales, place names. But mostly, it's ordinary people who survive. People who plant crops, raise children, navigate whatever political system rules them, and endure. Egyptian identity has outlasted pharaohs, caliphs, and presidents because it's rooted in place in the Nile Valley, in the stubborn fact of living where ancestors lived for millennia. That geography is now threatened by forces unprecedented in Egyptian history. Climate change, upstream dams, population growth beyond carrying capacities. Challenges are different in scale and kind from anything Egypt has faced before. The river is no longer enough. The question is whether human institutions can adapt, whether choices made today can create systems resilient enough for the challenges ahead. Egypt has always been an experiment in building order from environmental constraints, in creating civilization from a river. For 7,000 years, that experiment has continued through countless collapses and rebirths. Whether it can continue depends on solving the problem that has defined Egypt from the beginning: how to distribute scarce resources fairly and sustainably while maintaining the institutions that do the distributing. The Nile gave Egypt opportunity. Humans built the civilization. The institutions must now adapt to conditions the founders never imagined. The pyramids will outlast us all. They've already outlasted empires, religions, and languages. But the civilization that built them exists now only in deciphered inscriptions and archaeological reconstructions. Modern Egypt is connected to ancient Egypt by geography and by the river, but the continuity is threads, not chains. Threads can be cut, rivers can be dammed. Even the most enduring systems eventually transform beyond recognition. Egypt's story is ultimately about human choice in the face of overwhelming constraints. Choices to centralize or fragment, resist or collaborate, build monuments or invest in people, seek autarky or integration, cling to tradition or embrace change. Some choices were wise, many were not, but they were choices made by people trying to navigate forces larger than themselves, trying to understand patterns they saw only dimly. We do the same today, looking back at their monuments, marveling at their achievements, wondering how they managed, forgetting that they wondered the same about their own ancestors. The Nile still flows from the highlands of Ethiopia and the lakes of East Africa, through Sudan, into Egypt, to the Mediterranean. Cairo still sprawls across both banks, home to over 20 million in the metropolitan area. The desert still encroaches, held back by irrigation that depends on water increasingly contested. Egypt endures into the 21st century as it has endured through all previous centuries, not because of divine favor or geographic determinism or cultural superiority, but because people choose every day to stay, to plant, to build, to believe that tomorrow will come and that it's worth preparing for. That has been enough for 7,000 years. Whether it remains enough when the rivers flow is uncertain. When the climate destabilizes, when institutions strain under pressures they were never designed to handle, that question will be answered by the choices made in the coming decades. Egypt has answered similar questions before, many times, through collapse and renewal. The Nile remains. Egypt remains. In what form and for how long is being decided now by the living, who will become ancestors to those who will ask the same questions we ask today. The river doesn't forget, even when humans do. 7,000 years of history compress into sediment layers, into the foundations of buildings constructed on the ruins of buildings constructed on still older ruins. In Cairo, you can dig down and find Fatimid structures built over Roman foundations, built over Ptolemaic settlements. The archaeology is vertical, a stratigraphic record of civilizations layering one atop another, each convinced of its permanence, each now reduced to fragments that specialists argue over. This layering reveals something uncomfortable about the human relationship with time. We experience history as linear: past, present, future, but civilizations experience it cyclically. Egypt has risen, fractured, been conquered, absorbed its conquerors, and risen again so many times that the pattern itself becomes meaningful. The specifics change. The conquerors speak different languages, worship different gods, extract wealth through different mechanisms, but the underlying dynamic remains. Power concentrates, becomes extractive, loses legitimacy, fragments. Then someone reconsolidates power by promising to restore order, and the cycle begins again. Modern Egyptians are acutely aware of this history in ways that shape political consciousness. When Sisi presents himself as a strong man, restoring order after the chaos of the Arab Spring, he's invoking a narrative as old as the Middle Kingdom pharaohs who restored Mat after the First Intermediate Period. The language has changed from cosmic order to national security, from divine kingship to military necessity, but the psychological appeal is identical. Order versus chaos, strength versus weakness, unity versus fragmentation. These binaries have structured Egyptian political thought for millennia, and they continue to structure it today. But there's a crucial difference between ancient cycles and contemporary challenges. The ancient intermediate periods were resolved when environmental conditions stabilized, or when a strong dynasty reconsolidated power through military force and administrative competence. The challenges Egypt faces in the 21st century cannot be resolved through traditional methods. You cannot conquer your way out of water scarcity. You cannot build monuments that generate economic growth. You cannot impose order on climate systems or demographic pressures through authoritarian decree. This mismatch between the tools available and the problems to be solved creates a dangerous situation. The Egyptian state, shaped by millennia of centralization and centuries of military dominance, is institutionally oriented toward command and control. But the problems require cooperation, innovation, and adaptation. Water sharing with Ethiopia requires negotiation and compromise, not military threats. Economic development requires unleashing entrepreneurship, not military monopolies. Climate adaptation requires bottom-up resilience, not top-down megaprojects. The disconnect is visible in policy choices. The new administrative capital is a perfect example. It's a monumental project in the pharaonic tradition, a new capital built from scratch to signal power and permanence. But its economic logic is questionable. It absorbs tens of billions in investment that could have gone to education, healthcare, infrastructure that serves ordinary citizens. It creates a sterile administrative city divorced from the messy, vibrant reality of Cairo. It's built for the elite, not the masses. In this sense, it resembles the ancient royal cities more than modern capital cities designed around citizen needs. There's a psychological dimension to this project worth examining. Cairo is overwhelming, congested, polluted, chaotic, but alive with human energy. The informal neighborhoods where most Cairenes live are dense, noisy, and difficult to control. From the perspective of an authoritarian state, Cairo represents ungovernable complexity. The new capital represents control. Wide boulevards instead of narrow alleyways, planned spaces instead of organic growth, security checkpoints instead of open access. It's an attempt to escape the messy reality of Egyptian society by building an idealized alternative. But you cannot build your way out of social contradictions. The problems that make Cairo chaotic: population density, economic inequality, lack of opportunity, will not disappear because the government relocates to a sanitized new city. They will intensify. The new capital will become a fortress of privilege, while Cairo's 20 million residents continue struggling with traffic, pollution, inadequate services, and economic precarity. The gap between state and society, already wide, will become a chasm. This pattern, elites distancing themselves from the populations they govern, is not new in Egyptian history. The Ptolemies lived in Alexandria, a Greek city culturally and linguistically separated from the Egyptian countryside. The Mamluks were slave soldiers who never fully integrated with the Arabic-speaking Egyptian population. The British lived in segregated neighborhoods and clubs. But there's a difference between foreign rulers who are explicitly separate and a native authoritarian regime that creates separation through architectural and geographic means. The economic model Sisi has pursued raises fundamental questions about Egypt's development trajectory. The heavy involvement of the military in the economic construction, agriculture, consumer goods, even water bottling, creates a paradox. The military is not subject to normal market competition, regulatory oversight, or transparency requirements. It receives privileged access to land, cheap inputs, and government contracts. This crowds out private sector development and creates a dual economy where military enterprises thrive while civilian businesses struggle. Economic theory suggests this should lead to inefficiency and stagnation, and there's evidence this is occurring. Egyptian entrepreneurs face regulatory obstacles, corruption, and competition from military entities with unfair advantages. The most talented often emigrate. Foreign investors, despite government courting, remain wary of a system where rules are opaque and military interests can override commercial logic. The result is an economy that grows slowly, creates insufficient jobs, and depends heavily on external financing, Gulf aid, IMF loans, remittances, rather than productive domestic activity. This model resembles what economists call a rentier state, a state that derives income from external rents rather than taxation of productive domestic activity. Classic rentier states are oil exporters like Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, where government revenue comes from selling natural resources rather than taxing citizens. Egypt is a different variant. Instead of oil, Egypt's rents come from the Suez Canal, tourism, foreign aid, remittances, and increasingly from asset sales to Gulf states. The government's relationship with its citizens is not primarily extractive in the traditional tax sense, but rather distributive, providing subsidized goods and services, which creates dependency without accountability. Political scientists note that rentier states tend toward authoritarianism because the social contract doesn't require genuine representation. If the government's revenue doesn't come primarily from taxing citizens, it doesn't need their consent in the way that states dependent on domestic taxation do. No taxation without representation was a revolutionary slogan because taxation creates a relationship requiring negotiation. But if the state finances itself through external rents, it can ignore citizen demands. This describes Egypt increasingly accurately. The social consequences are profound. A large population of young people cannot find meaningful employment. Education has expanded, literacy rates have improved dramatically since the 1950s, but education quality has declined. Universities produce graduates without skills employers need. The mismatch between credentials and competence is severe. A university degree, which guaranteed a government job under Nasser, now means very little. Graduates drive taxis, work in call centers, or remain unemployed. The psychological impact of thwarted expectations cannot be overstated. This creates what political scientists call a youth bulge, a demographic situation where a large percentage of the population is young, unemployed, or underemployed, and frustrated. Historically, youth bulges correlate with political instability. The Arab Spring was driven partially by demographics, millions of educated young people with no economic prospects, channeling frustration into political demands. The revolution didn't solve the underlying problem. If anything, the economic situation has worsened since 20. The youth bulge persists. The frustration persists, but the outlets for expression have been closed by repression. What happens to political energy when it has no legitimate outlet? Sometimes it dissipates into apathy. People withdraw from politics, focus on survival, emigrate if possible. Sometimes it channels into religion. The Muslim Brotherhood grew for decades by providing social services and a sense of meaning that the state did not. Sometimes it explodes in violence. The jihadist insurgency in the Sinai Peninsula, which has intensified since 2013, draws recruits from marginalized communities with grievances and no other channels for expression. The Sinai insurgency deserves attention because it reveals state weaknesses that official narratives obscure. The Sinai Peninsula, particularly North Sinai, has never been fully integrated into the Egyptian state. Bedouin tribes have lived there for centuries with minimal government presence. The state has historically viewed Sinai as a security buffer between Egypt proper and Israel, rather than as territory to develop and integrate. After the Camp David Accords returned Sinai to Egypt, development remained minimal. Bedouins felt neglected, discriminated against, economically marginalized. After Morsi's overthrow, an insurgency emerged, initially called Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, later pledging allegiance to ISIS and rebranding as Wilat Sinai. The insurgency has conducted hundreds of attacks against military and police targets, occasionally targeting civilians. The military response has been heavy-handed, demolishing homes, displacing populations, collective punishment of communities suspected of harboring militants. Human rights organizations have documented abuses, extrajudicial killings, torture, forced disappearances. The insurgency persists despite years of military operations because the underlying grievances remain unaddressed. Heavy-handed security responses without economic development or political inclusion often intensify insurgencies rather than ending them. People who might otherwise avoid violence are radicalized by state brutality. Families whose homes are demolished become recruits. Communities subjected to collective punishment lose any incentive to cooperate with authorities. This is a pattern seen in counterinsurgencies worldwide. Military force alone cannot defeat an insurgency rooted in legitimate grievances. Egypt's relationship with its Coptic Christian minority provides another window into social cohesion and state legitimacy. Copts have faced increasing marginalization and violence over recent decades. Attacks on churches have become more frequent. Sectarian incidents, conflicts between Muslims and Christians over church construction, conversions, personal disputes that escalate are poorly handled by authorities who often pressure Christians to reconcile rather than pursuing justice. Emigration rates among Copts are high, particularly among educated professionals. Entire Coptic villages in Upper Egypt have emptied as families move to Cairo or abroad. The state's response has been contradictory. Sisi publicly embraces Copts, attends Christmas Mass at the cathedral, speaks of national unity. But structural discrimination persists. Building or renovating churches requires permits that are difficult to obtain. Copts are underrepresented in senior government, military, and judicial positions. Sectarian attacks often go unpunished or result in minimal sentences. The rhetoric of inclusion clashes with the reality of exclusion. This matters because social cohesion is essential for navigating the challenges ahead. A society fracturing along religious, class, and regional lines cannot effectively address collective problems. Climate adaptation, economic development, water negotiations with Ethiopia, these require national unity and shared purpose. If significant portions of the population feel excluded or persecuted, mobilizing collective effort becomes impossible. The generational dimension of Egypt's crisis is particularly acute. Older Egyptians who remember Nasser's era, the October War, the early Sadat years, have a different psychological reference point than young people born in the 1990s and 2000s. For older generations, Egypt has experienced progress. Literacy, health, infrastructure have all improved compared to the 1950s. For younger generations, the comparison point is the present, and the trajectory seems bleak. They see corruption, stagnation, authoritarianism, and limited futures. This generational divide shapes political attitudes. Older Egyptians often prioritized stability. Having lived through the chaos of the intermediate periods, the wars with Israel, the uncertainties of the Arab Spring, they are more willing to accept authoritarianism in exchange for order. Younger Egyptians, who have known only Mubarak and Sisi, are more willing to risk instability for the possibility of change. The Arab Spring was driven by youth. The counter-revolution was supported by older generations frightened of chaos. But there's a deeper question about what development means in the Egyptian context. For decades, development was understood primarily as state-led modernization, industrialization, infrastructure, literacy, healthcare. These are measurable, and Egypt has made progress on many metrics. But development is also about capability, the ability of individuals to make meaningful choices about their lives, to develop their potential, to participate in shaping their society. By this standard, Egypt has regressed. The space for individual choice has narrowed. Political participation is suppressed. Economic opportunities are limited. Education does not lead to advancement. This disconnect between quantitative progress and qualitative regression creates cognitive dissonance. The state can point to statistics: kilometers of roads built, hospitals opened, subsidies provided, while citizens experience deteriorating quality of life. Traffic worsens despite new roads. Hospitals lack equipment and trained staff. Subsidies don't keep pace with inflation. This gap between official narrative and lived experience erodes trust in institutions and legitimacy of governance. International relations scholars studying Egypt debate whether it should be classified as a failed state, a fragile state, or a resilient, authoritarian state. The answer depends on what metrics you prioritize. By some measures, territorial control, monopoly on violence, international recognition is clearly a functioning state. By others, rule of law, government effectiveness, corruption control. Egypt scores poorly. The state is simultaneously strong in its capacity for repression and weak in its capacity to deliver services, foster development, or respond to citizen needs. This combination, strong repressive capacity, weak developmental capacity, characterizes many authoritarian regimes. The security services are well funded, trained, and effective at surveillance and suppression. But the agencies responsible for education, healthcare, economic regulation are underfunded, inefficient, and corrupt. Resources flow toward control, not development. This is rational from the regime's perspective. Staying in power requires suppressing opposition, not necessarily improving lives, but it's catastrophic for long-term national development. Egypt's foreign policy under Sisi has been transactional and oriented toward regime survival rather than national interest in the broad sense. Alignment with Gulf states brings financial support, but also involves Egypt in regional conflicts, supporting Haftar in Libya, participating in the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen initially, taking positions on regional issues that reflect Gulf preferences. This subordination to Gulf interests is a far cry from Nasser's leadership of the non-aligned movement, or even Sadat's bold diplomacy. The relationship with Israel has deepened significantly, driven by shared security interests. Both Egypt and Israel see Hamas and jihadist groups in Sinai as threats, but it remains unpopular with the Egyptian public. Security cooperation happens quietly, without acknowledgement. Gas deals that import Israeli gas to Egypt, despite Egypt having its own reserves, generate resentment. The perception that Egypt's government serves Israeli security interests while abandoning the Palestinian cause erodes legitimacy, particularly among Islamists and nationalists. The Gulf states' leverage over Egypt is immense and growing. When Egypt faced economic crisis in 2016 and again in 2022, Gulf deposits in Egyptian banks prevented currency collapse. Gulf investment in Egyptian assets purchasing land, companies, development rights, provides revenue, but this creates dependency. Egypt's foreign policy flexibility is constrained by the need to maintain Gulf support. This is a form of informal colonialism where financial dependency translates into political subordination without formal occupation. The intellectual and cultural dimensions of Egypt's trajectory deserve attention. Egypt was once the cultural and intellectual center of the Arab world. Egyptian cinema, music, literature dominated Arabic culture from the 1930s through the 1980s. Al-Azhar University was the preeminent center of Islamic learning. Egyptian intellectuals, writers like Naguib Mahfouz, Taha Hussein, thinkers like Syed Qutb, feminists like Nawal el-Saadawi shaped Arab thought. This cultural prominence has faded. Gulf states, particularly UAE and Saudi Arabia, have displaced Egypt as cultural centers through massive investment in media, arts, and education. Lebanese and Syrian intellectuals, once drawn to Cairo, now go to Dubai or Beirut. Egyptian intellectuals emigrate. The repression of free expression, the closing of cultural spaces, the censorship and self-censorship have stifled creativity. What emerges is often sanitized, regime-approved culture that lacks edge or authenticity. The vibrancy that made Egyptian culture influential has been suffocated. This matters economically as well. The creative industries, film, music, design, media can be significant economic drivers, as demonstrated by South Korea's cultural exports or India's Bollywood industry. Egypt has the talent and the legacy, but lacks the freedom and investment needed to nurture creative industries. Another lost opportunity, another potential avenue for development closed by authoritarianism. Egypt, a land of ancient wonders, a civilization that mastered the Nile. But today, the challenges it faces are as vast as its history. It's a story of survival, a complex web of environmental crises, political dilemmas, and the immense weight of a glorious past meeting a precarious future. Beyond the postcard images of pyramids and temples lies a modern reality. Cairo's air is thick with pollution, ranking it among the worst in the world and leading to widespread health crises. The lifeblood of the nation, the Nile itself, is choked with agricultural runoff, industrial waste, and raw sewage. In many neighborhoods, garbage piles up, a stark symbol of overwhelmed systems. The very rhythm that sustained ancient Egypt, the annual flood that fertilized the land, was stopped by the Aswan High Dam. We built a new system, but we never truly replaced what was lost. And then there's the desert. It's creeping in. Overgrazing and changing climate are turning precious farmland back into sand. Egypt has so little arable land to begin, with just 3% of its territory. And that tiny sliver is being squeezed by sprawling cities and damaged by poor irrigation. We hear about grand visions to green the desert, massive projects to reclaim the sands for agriculture. It sounds inspiring, but it hits a hard wall of reality. Desert farming requires colossal amounts of water and energy for pumping. Water and energy that Egypt simply doesn't have. This creates a strange disconnect. The government announces futuristic new cities and plans to become a regional energy giant, but back on the ground, sewage overflows. The air is hard to breathe, and the water quality is getting worse. This isn't unique to Egypt, but the scale of the problem here, against the backdrop of such scarce resources, is staggering. This brings us to the most critical issue of all, the one that could define Egypt's 21st century, the water of the Nile and the grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. This isn't just a story of Ethiopia trying to harm Egypt. It's a story of a nation trying to lift itself from poverty. 70 million Ethiopians live without electricity. From their perspective, building this dam to generate power is a sovereign right. The Nile flows through their land, so why should they stay poor just to keep Egypt comfortable? But from Egypt's side, the stakes are nothing short of existential. 95% of its water comes from the Nile. There is no plan B. If the river's flow drops significantly, even for just a few years while the dam's reservoir is filled, the consequences would be catastrophic. Agriculture would collapse. Millions would face drinking water shortages. This isn't fear-mongering. The numbers are brutal. Egypt is already below the water poverty line. Any reduction is a direct threat. Both sides have a valid point. And that's what makes this a true tragedy to legitimate, vital interests locked in an irreconcilable conflict. International water law is vague. It talks about equitable utilization. But what is equitable when one country faces potential collapse and the other faces perpetual poverty? Egypt points to colonial-era treaties, giving it veto power, but Ethiopia rightly dismisses these as relics of an unjust past. Years of negotiations have gone nowhere because their core interests are opposed. Ethiopia wants to fill the dam quickly, in just a few years, to start generating power and revenue. Egypt needs them to fill it slowly, over 15 or 20 years, to avoid a devastating shock to its water supply. The difference between those timelines is the difference between manageable adaptation and national crisis for Egypt, and the difference between rapid progress and frustrating delay for Ethiopia. Of course, technical solutions exist. They could coordinate how they manage their dams. Egypt could invest heavily in water-saving technology. They could cooperate on a regional level. But all of that requires trust, and trust is the one resource that's completely dried up. Egypt fears Ethiopia will use the dam as a political weapon. Ethiopia fears Egypt wants to keep it underdeveloped. It's a classic security dilemma, where each country's attempt to protect itself only makes the other feel more threatened. You sometimes hear whispers of military action in Cairo, but a strike on the dam would be an act of madness. It's built in a deep gorge. Destroying it could unleash a wall of water that would devastate Sudan before it even reached Egypt. The humanitarian crisis would be unimaginable, and Egypt would become an international pariah. It's an irrational option, but the rhetoric persists because admitting you're powerless is politically toxic. The only real path forward is for Egypt to accept its vulnerability and negotiate from that reality. It means offering Ethiopia something of real value investment, technology, cooperation, in exchange for a binding agreement on how the dam will be operated. It means building trust, step by step. It might even mean accepting a painful truth that Egypt's future may lie in moving away from water-heavy agriculture and fundamentally restructuring its economy. But that's a tough pill to swallow. For a culture built on millennia of being a regional power, of being the gift of the Nile, Admitting that your survival depends on the goodwill of another nation is a profound psychological blow. The weight of being the heirs to the pharaohs can make it harder to adapt to a diminished reality. This whole crisis shines a light on a bigger problem. Our global system of nation-states, built on the idea of sovereignty, is struggling to handle challenges that don't respect borders like shared rivers, climate change, or mass migration. Everyone knows cooperation is the best answer, but the incentive is always for each country to look out for itself first. The Nile Basin Initiative was supposed to be a forum for cooperation, but it's been stuck for years because the upstream and downstream countries have completely different goals, and climate change is going to pour fuel on this fire. Projections show that the source of the Nile in East Africa will see more extreme weather, harsher droughts, and more intense floods. This uncertainty makes planning almost impossible for Egypt. Ironically, Ethiopia's dam could act as a stabilizer, storing water in wet years and releasing it in dry ones, benefiting everyone. But again, that would require a level of trust and cooperation that simply isn't there. You can see these tensions playing out in Egypt's cities. Cairo's population has exploded from 2 million in 1952 over 20 million today. It's completely unsustainable. Millions live in informal settlements, vibrant and resilient communities, but lacking basic services and living under constant threat of eviction. The government's response has been to build massive new cities in the desert, including a brand new administrative capital. But they often forget the most important thing: jobs. People move to Cairo for opportunity. Building shiny new housing in the middle of nowhere doesn't solve the problem if there's no way to make a living there. It just creates ghost towns. Ultimately, this all leads back to the question of political reform. The idea that authoritarian rule creates stability is a dangerous illusion. It's not stability, it's repressed instability. The pressure just builds and builds beneath the surface until it explodes, which is exactly what happened in 2011. Some looked at the Arab Spring and concluded that reform is too risky, that it leads to chaos. But the real lesson is that refusing to reform is what leads to the explosion. The longer you delay, the more violent the eventual release. Gradual, managed change is always safer than rigid control that waits for the dam to break. Egypt stands at a crossroads, facing monumental challenges that are all interconnected. The solutions won't be easy. They will require courage, pragmatism, and a willingness to rethink age-old narratives. It's a story we should all be watching, because the fate of the Nile is the fate of 100 million people. Thanks for watching. But authoritarian regimes face a dilemma. Reform requires loosening control, allowing opposition to organize, tolerating criticism. But once you start loosening control, you risk losing it entirely. Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika led to the Soviet Union's collapse. Eastern European communist regimes that attempted reform in the 1980s fell. This creates rational fear among autocrats that any reform begins an uncontrollable slide. So they choose rigid control, postponing the reckoning, but likely making it more severe when it comes. Egypt's political opposition faces its own challenges. The Muslim Brotherhood, once the most organized force, is decimated, leaders imprisoned, exiled, or driven underground. The liberal opposition that led the Tahrir protests was never well organized and has been thoroughly repressed. Youth movements have been crushed. Civil society is under assault. who could lead a future transition? The absence of credible alternatives strengthens the regime's claim that the choice is Sisi or chaos. This is partially true and partially a situation the regime created. By systematically destroying all opposition, the regime ensures no alternative leadership develops. Then it points to the absence of alternatives as justification for continued rule. It's circular logic, but politically effective. Building opposition capacity requires time, space, resources, precisely what the regime denies, so the claim becomes self-fulfilling. The military's role in any future political evolution is determinative. The military has been the backbone of the state since 1952. Every president has been a military officer except Morsi, and his presidency was terminated by the military. The officer corps sees itself as guardian of the nation, protector of stability, arbiter of political legitimacy. This institutional identity makes civilian control unlikely without a fundamental shift in civil-military relations. Comparative cases offer limited guidance. Indonesia's military eventually accepted civilian control after the Suharto regime fell, but this took years and required international pressure, economic crisis, and internal military reform. Turkey's military, which staged multiple coups from the 1960s through the 1990s, has been subordinated to civilian control under Erdogan, though at the cost of democratic erosion. Chile's military negotiated a transition after Pinochet, but retained significant privileges. Each path reflects specific historical circumstances difficult to replicate. Egypt's military is more deeply entrenched economically than any of these cases. Indonesian, Turkish, Chilean militaries did not control 40% of their national economies. Asking Egypt's military to relinquish economic power is asking them to accept massive institutional loss. Why would they? What incentives exist? International pressure is minimal. The United States values Egypt for regional stability and Israeli security, not for democracy. Gulf states prefer authoritarianism. Europe wants Egypt to control migration. Nobody with leverage is pushing for democratic reform. This raises uncomfortable questions about international complicity in Egyptian authoritarianism. Western governments that proclaim support for democracy provide weapons, aid, and diplomatic support to a regime that imprisons tens of thousands, massacres protesters, and stifles all opposition. The justification is that Egypt is a necessary partner for regional stability, counterterrorism, migration control. This is realpolitik, privileging short-term interests over principles, but the stability is illusory. Authoritarian regimes that don't reform don't actually provide stability, they defer instability. When they eventually fall, the transitions are chaotic, precisely because no institutions exist for peaceful change. Supporting authoritarianism in the name of stability actually creates future instability. This is the pattern across the region: Western support for autocrats in the name of stability, followed by revolutions and chaos when regimes eventually fall. The economic logic of supporting autocrats is also questionable. Authoritarian regimes with state-controlled economies, corruption, and poor governance don't generate prosperity. They may provide short-term predictability for certain investors, but long-term economic dynamism requires rule of law, property rights, competitive markets, and innovation. Things authoritarianism suppresses. Egypt's economic stagnation under Mubarak and Sisi demonstrates this. Supporting democratic reform and genuine market economies would serve long-term Western interests better than supporting autocrats. But international actors operate on short-time horizons and respond to immediate pressures. Politicians want stability during their terms, even if the cost is future chaos. Businesses want access now, even if the institutional environment degrades over time. Security services want cooperation on immediate threats, even if authoritarianism breeds future extremism. The incentives all push toward accepting and enabling authoritarianism. Egypt's intellectual history includes voices that diagnosed these problems with clarity. Taha Hussein, writing in the early 20th century, argued Egypt needed to embrace modernization, democracy, and secular education to overcome backwardness. Syed Qutb, radicalized by imprisonment under Nasser, developed Islamist ideology that influenced militant movements but also diagnosed the moral bankruptcy of secular authoritarian nationalism. Nawal el-Saadawi critiqued patriarchy, authoritarianism, and the intersection of political and gender oppression. These voices, often suppressed in their time, identified core tensions that remain unresolved. The tragedy is that solutions are known. Economic development requires investment in human capital, rule of law, competitive markets, and reduction of state and military economic control. Political stability requires inclusive institutions that allow peaceful competition and meaningful participation. Environmental sustainability requires water conservation, pollution control, and climate adaptation. Social cohesion requires ending discrimination and creating shared national identity beyond coercion. But knowing solutions and implementing them are different. Implementation requires political will, institutional capacity, and acceptance of short-term costs for long-term gains. Authoritarian regimes optimize for short-term control, not long-term development. The military prioritizes institutional interests over national development. Elites prioritize wealth extraction over investment. International actors prioritize immediate stability over supporting reform. The incentive structures work against the very changes needed. This creates a sense of determinism, of Egypt locked into a trajectory difficult to escape. But determinism is a trap. History is contingent. Small events can cascade into large changes. Leadership matters. Choices matter. The Arab Spring was not predicted, emerged from contingent events that cascaded. Future inflection points will come. The question is whether Egypt will be prepared to navigate them constructively, or whether they will produce another cycle of uprising, chaos, and authoritarian restoration. The role of external actors in Egypt's future cannot be ignored, but it also shouldn't be overstated. Ultimately, Egypt's trajectory will be determined primarily by Egyptians, the choices made by leaders, the actions of movements, the responses of citizens to challenges. External actors can support or hinder, but they cannot determine outcomes. This is both liberating and burdensome. Liberating because it means Egyptian agency exists. Burdensome because it means responsibility cannot be entirely externalized. The Nile remains the ultimate reality, constraining all else. Everything in Egypt returns to water. The economy depends on it. Agriculture requires it. Cities need it. Power generation uses it. Life follows it. When ancient Egyptians said Egypt is the gift of the Nile, they understood a truth still valid today. Every challenge Egypt faces, food, security, energy, employment, development, connects to water. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is not a single issue among many. It's the issue that encompasses all others. This brings us full circle to the question posed at the beginning. The river doesn't care about empires. It flows according to rainfall patterns, geological constraints, and now human infrastructure. For 7,000 years, Egyptians have built civilization around the assumption that the river would flow, that the flood would come, that the gift would continue. That assumption is now uncertain in ways it has never been before. The pyramids stand silent, monuments to civilizations that believed they would endure forever. They did endure as stone, but the cultures that built them, the languages they spoke, the gods they worshipped, the systems they created, all are gone, preserved only in fragments. What remains is the land, the river, and the people who continue living where their ancestors lived, navigating new challenges with old memories as guides. Egypt's story is not finished. It cannot be finished as long as the Nile flows and people live in the valley. But the next chapters will be written under conditions unprecedented in the long history. Climate change, population pressure, regional competition, technological change, global economic integration. These forces create a context the pharaohs never imagined. The challenge is whether the institutions, the culture, the collective wisdom accumulated over millennia can adapt to these new realities. The answer is not predetermined. It will emerge from countless decisions made by individuals and institutions, from policies pursued and abandoned, from conflicts resolved or intensified, from choices made under pressure with imperfect information. Just as previous generations of Egyptians navigated their challenges, some successfully, some catastrophically, the current generation navigates its own, knowing the stakes are survival itself. The river still flows, Cairo still sprawls, the desert still encroaches. Egypt endures, for now, in the 21st century, as it has endured through all the centuries before. Not because endurance is guaranteed, not because the weight of history makes it inevitable, but because people choose every day to continue, to plant knowing the harvest is uncertain, to build knowing the future is unknown, to believe that tomorrow will come and is worth preparing for, that has been enough for 7,000 years. Whether it will be enough for 7 more, or 700, or 7,000, depends on choices not yet made, on challenges not yet fully emerged, on adaptations not yet imagined. The river doesn't care, but the people who depend on it care intensely. Their choices, their struggles, their successes and failures will write the next chapters of a story that began when the first settlements clustered around the annual flood and decided to build something permanent from the rich black soil. Egypt is not inevitable. It never was. It was chosen, built, maintained, rebuilt after every collapse, reimagined after every conquest. That work continues.